Good afternoon, and welcome to this seminar here at NUPI on gendered peacekeeping beyond the female body. My name is Morten Bøås. I will not do anything else than share this meeting to make certain that our panelists more or less stay on track with regard to the time designated to them. And I may ask a question or two at the end before we open it up to the floor. We'll see about that. Anyway, I mean, I'm very much looking forward to this. Issues concerning peacekeeping and gender are issues that both people here at NUPI has worked on for a long time. It's also been an important theme for other Norwegian research institutions, for instance at PRIO and elsewhere in Norway. And it's interesting to see that, I mean, in new and fresh ways, I mean, people are continuing to use issues concerning gender and gender studies as a way of offering a critique of parts of the international system and of the way that peacekeeping is being done. Today we have first and foremost Dr. Paul Highgate, which is a reader in gender and security at the School of Sociology, Politics and International Studies at the University of Bristol. Paul has written a lot of interesting stuff about these kind of issues, peacekeeping issues concerning gender, so I'll very much look forward to this. Secondly, it's Randi Solhjell, which is a researcher here at NUPI, who will discuss gender perspectives in UN and African Union peace operations. Randi has been working on these and similar issues, also working in the Congo for quite a long time. About to finish also her PhD, I believe, at the London School of Economics. A PhD I look forward to reading. And finally, we have Kathleen Jennings, which is a researcher at FAFO, who has contributed many interesting articles on issues concerning peacekeeping and gender. And Kathleen is also collaborating, my partner in crime, in our Peacekeeping Economies project that we will wrap up next year. So without further ado, Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Morten, for the introduction. That's great. It's very good to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Randy. That's fantastic. So today I want to talk a little bit about some of the work I've been doing actually around private security and the concept of geocorporality, which is a horrible word. I apologize for that. But what I want to do today is try to think about how we might apply that or get that, use that as a way to think about female peacekeepers, focusing on the question of the body. So a lot of my earlier work has been on embodiment and the body, and thinking about the importance of how to theorize the body in its everyday practice in a kind of more sociological sense. So what I'll do in the next few minutes is I'll give you a little overview of the concept of geocorporality. I'll outline the argument I'm trying to make. It's not a very consistent or coherent argument necessarily, but what it might do is just get us to think about how we can look at the body in a particular way. So in this sense, I want to operationalize the concept in the third point there as embodiment as empathy, and you'll see how that works. Bodies of authority, and I'm thinking here about how female peacekeepers are constructed in particular narratives, but also how they present themselves to their beneficiaries, or how they're encouraged to present themselves to their beneficiary groups. Some reflections on the foregoing, and finally a sort of round-up conclusion, and I think we have questions a little bit later on as a group. Okay, so a little bit of background to the term geocorporality. Again, I apologize, it's not an easy term to say, and I'll stumble over it throughout this, but I first coined this term in a piece of work I did on private security contractors. And there's an article in International Political Sociology which outlines, how that term is used, but in a sense, I've used it to try to understand how private military security companies have recruited majority ex-military personnel for their embodied skill sets. So the use of weapons, drill, enclosed protection, bodyguarding, and how the industry has been made possible by recruiting people with those kinds of backgrounds. So these skill sets, if you like, are deeply embodied, and they're pre-reflective. So if you're effective in the military context, in a combat arms perspective, you need to have certain skills that you don't actually reflect on and think about, but they are trained into the body. So they're kind of a highly embodied set of practices that are beyond kind of conscious decision-making processes to a large extent. We can talk about some of the kind of complexities there. So just to think about how this could be applied to peacekeeping in the first instance here, I want to recognise, unlike private military security, there tends to be an awful degree of diversity in peacekeeping roles. So it can be anything from a Chapter 7 mandate that will need peace enforcement approaches, right through to a more kind of aid context, where peacekeepers are going out into community and doing things which are much more, quite different from military tasks. Now, why the body? Well, in the work I've been doing, I've thought that really what's important here is without the body on the ground doing the work, the peacekeeping moment, if you like, can't actually happen. It depends, is reliant on, and is made possible by bodies in practice. So I use the word vectors there to indicate that the body on the ground, the peacekeeper body, if you like, is the point through which this power is exercised. And when we start to think along those terms, we then collapse the differences perhaps between some abstract nation of the international or the state, and we think about the body as the point of convergence between everyday practice on the ground and the national, international kind of sphere through which it's enacted. Geocorporality also depends on another analytical move, and that's to think about embodiment in its phenomenological and habituated aspect. So I already mentioned there the importance of thinking about the body that can be trained and as a repository of meaning and practice beyond necessary kind of reflection. So bodies are trained in particular ways. A soldier will dive for cover when they hear a loud bang. This is the body in practice. This is the body in motion. This is a body that responds almost at a non-conscious level in that respect. And the more effective soldiers will be able to do that, in combat situations or in security situations, and affect their military role competently. So geocorporality tries to marry the high-level kind of ideas of what the geopolitics are of a particular intervention, in this case peacekeeping, with how bodies enact that in particular ways on the ground. Now, when I started to look at the role of female peacekeepers, I have done work on peacekeeping in the past, but I had a little look actually more recently at the YouTube clips of, if you put in female peacekeepers, you get a series of little videos there. So I was interested really in kind of developing a sensitivity to how those bodies are portrayed, how those women are portrayed in peacekeeping. What aims and objectives and what added kinds of value are brought to bear when thinking about how women might interact with their beneficiary population. So this argument really will take us off into the discussion, but in a sense, this is also the conclusion. The United Nations, in this particular case, it could be other international bodies, face a challenge in reconciling women's added value, if that's how we see it, adding value to a peacekeeping mission, as empathizing bodies with their attempt to engender credibility through masculinizing them as bodies of authority. So you'll see, if you look at these clips of videos, and this is something that's been discussed before, for women to be taken seriously, they have to perform as competently as men, of course, and that's a key here. That depends on certain actions of the body, which we'll get back to in a second, to do with fitness and training and military effectiveness. But in turn, what happens when you focus on the body in that respect, what you end up seeing is actually, rather minimizing difference between males and females, or men and women, or the two genders, if you like, what you end up is reinforcing that difference in that move, in that process. So the question of military competence can get squeezed out because it always becomes the thing, in this case, that is used as the benchmark. Well, how effective are these women? Are they acting like the men in that respect? There's more to it than that, but that's one aspect that I'll touch on shortly. So what we see here is the question of embodiment as a form of empathy. So we'll see the claims that are made for women in the field in doing peacekeeping work is that they are much more approachable because they have an intuitive insight into the situation that women face in post-conflict contexts. So it could be sexual or domestic violence. It could be a reassurance that they are not men and therefore not likely to be disposed to the violence and aggression that has been endured by those populations. And it's assumed in this sense that women have embodied insights. They have a maternality, if you like, a commonality that provides an approachable resource for beneficiaries in those contexts. So the appeal here is a particular unspoken phenomenological conception of the body that often alludes actually to its reproductive status. So they're often presented as mothers as well, but not always explicitly. That's part of the kind of overall narrative that's informing the fact that they are approachable. There's a common degree of commonality there. And the other thing here, just I highlight the word unspoken because, of course, in many situations, the female peacekeepers don't actually speak the same language as the beneficiary population. So a lot of this is depending on a presentation of the embodied self and the hope that that will somehow reassure in its performance. And then we move to what I mentioned earlier, and this is how female bodies are assessed within the context of whether or not they are as competent as the men. Are they as good as the male peacekeepers? So the challenge there is to demonstrate, and when you look at these videos, you'll see quite a lot of discussion about, well, you know, they're just as skilled as the men. You can see them doing drill here. You can see them doing exercises. You know, these females they can match their male superiors. So often that's in terms of, you'll see them carrying weapons. You'll see them, you know, drilling and marching. So they're presented as fit, responsive, and decisive. Their bodies are trained in particular ways that can meet the demands that men have to face and are the same. And of course, this is all playing into a hierarchy of gender. So you don't see the same narrative from the perspective of men, of course. It's just for women that have to meet the same standard to be one of the boys. Okay, so that's quite a lot to throw into the mix, but now I just want to take a little step back and unpack some of the things I've been saying in terms of analysis through a direct focus on the body or the embodied lens. So what I want to argue, really, going back to the overall argument, is the bodies that present themselves in peacekeeping missions are coming from diverse cultural, social, and military backgrounds. And as such, they embody repertoires of meaning and social practice in regard to both empathy and authority, as we've seen. But the main point to stress is that actually this might not necessarily be about gender as such, because if you take a female peacekeeper from a particular global south country, their military expertise may be quite different from a female or a male even from a different country. So what they're presenting that peacekeeping mission isn't always down to the fact that they're females, and that's the key thing here. And the constant restatement that female bodies can be trained to be as good as their superior male counterparts actually reinforces the differences, the narratives that the UN or whatever organization it is seeking to overcome. So there are a number of different things that flow from this, and there's a guy at University of Exeter, actually, I'll come to his work in a minute, Tony King, and he's been writing about how important it is actually not so much to have, you know, females working in ways that are seen as deficient within wider militaries, but to see professional drill and embodied practice as the most important factor in how social cohesion and bonds can form between platoons and between groups. So what I'm suggesting here, obviously there's lots to be said in terms of an argument against this, is to shift the lens from the focus on femininity actually, and to redirect it towards highly practical, social, cultural denominators factored through embodied practice rather than the kind of reification between the genders. So what we see here is competence actually flows, so the strength of social bonds flows from competence, not the other way around. So if a female peacekeeper in this example is very professional and very good at a job and has mastered the drills and the weaponry and presents themselves in a security context but very effectively, that's much more likely to enhance her kind of location in the wider group rather than just the fact that she's a female where she can normally be ignored. So the silences, if you like, from the more dominant narrative I've mentioned, captured in those YouTube clips and more widely, is that intramasculine difference is often ignored. So we focus on women as different, but actually when you look at the differences between national and cultural contexts, between men coming from different military backgrounds, what we see is an incredible degree of diversity and heterogeneity, which is not captured because there's this kind of focus on the gender binary and the gendered body. So the cultural differences often get squeezed out, with the focus falling directly on gender, and everything else flows from that point. So, you know, females are likely to be more effective for their female beneficiaries, although that's even anecdotally, that's not necessarily likely to be the case. However, we don't actually know how effective women are in the field. There are so few of them. Empirically, it's a big kind of gap in our knowledge. And I think in Liberia, there's 120 female peacekeepers out of 10,000. So we are looking at incredibly small numbers, and that then raises the question of, well, actually, this is a point about the performance of the gender presence. And also in terms of gender mainstreaming, questions of critical mass, the leaky, soft body, the female body, if you like, from discussion in the literature, is seen as a vehicle for change. But that's a political move, actually. That's a political move, and I think we just need to maybe take a step back and rather focus on that kind of essentialized gender, coming from kind of essentialist feminist work, is to take a step back from that and say, well, actually, what's going on here in terms of competence, military competence, in those contexts where that's important. Okay, so a lot of what I've said comes back to how we theorize the body, and I mentioned the importance of habit and drill and practice as embodied, but it also depends on what kind of security we're talking about as well. So that obviously we know there are many different kinds of security in peacekeeping missions. So much of what I've said has more direct kind of relationship to peace enforcement type contexts. And what we need to think about then is, like I said a little bit earlier on, is how effective are female peacekeepers from different countries in terms of their experiences of training and how far they've kind of embodied those effectively, and they can carry those out effectively in the field. And this is a question of military professionalism, which again, in a way, directs us away from this concern about gender, which dominates the literature and dominates thinking. So in Tony King's work there, the quotation is, doctrine, choreographies, and muscle memories are crucial here, not interpersonal bonds, as I say. So it's not about the bonds per se, it's about how effective and how much competence and how professional these women are perceived to be, from which flow the possibility for them not to be seen purely as women. So a more effective response, I'm saying, in some contexts, is not to highlight or perhaps reify femininity, but it's actually to look at the competence of the troops that are deployed. So you will see, again, from those YouTube clips, a real diversity in the professional, kind of military professionalism that has been deployed on the field, depending on the cultural and military context in which they're coming. And I think that's the question we should be focusing on, really, not so much whether or not they're women. So in that very quick kind of overview, I just wanted to give you a sense of how we might think about the body in a more kind of complex sense as a repertoire of habit and professional competence in the military context, rather than focusing on it as a gendered embodied moment, if you like. And this idea of gender neutrality, of course, these things are great at the level of discussion and theory, but politically and in policy terms, there's a lot more to be done, and how we might think about that. And it also touches very directly on how we think and practice security in its embodied aspect. So after all, if you think about soldiers in the combat arms, they're actually embodied to disembody. That's their role. And UN peacekeepers coming in to do peace enforcement, Chapter 7 mandates, are coming from those combat arms backgrounds. So that is their key skill set. That is their key skill set. How far might we move from theory to practice? So I'm standing here talking about geocorporality, which is a kind of, theory-heavy concept. So what does that mean when we take it out into the field? What does that mean for DPKO? What does it mean for how we, make peacekeeping more effective? And also, I don't want this to be seen necessarily as, everything that's going on in peacekeeping missions involving female peacekeepers is bad or negative or not working. It's always important to acknowledge the gains when we see them. So I just wanted to have that as a kind of footnote at the end to say, I focus on a particular aspect of peacekeeping and framed it in a very particular kind of way. But of course, we do need to be cautious about, being positive when necessary. Okay, thank you.
Great, Paul. Thanks. That was a lot of food for thought, and I'm certain that it has raised some questions, but we will wait with questions and comments until we have had also the two other presentations. So, Randi, please.
Thank you. Is this working? Yeah. No. Yeah? Okay.
Having a small technical error, so if this had been NRK in the good old days, we would have seen that old, pausefisk or teknisk feil clip. Unfortunately, we don't have that, but I'm certain that Randy will be soon up and going.
Yeah. Thank you. Sorry about that. And thank you, Paul, for a very good talk. And I do think it's quite relevant for what I'm going to talk about as well. Unfortunately, Ingvild Gjelsvik, who was supposed to be here, she's ill, so it's just going to be me talking. And this talk is based on a report that we did for the Training for Peace program here at NUPI regarding gender and gender perspectives within UN and within African Union peace operations. And for those interested, there are copies also there for free. Just grab one if you haven't done it already. And it's entitled Female Bodies and Masculine Norms, Gender Discourses in International Peace Operations. I think what has sparked also my interest in this study was the absence of dialogue between the abundance of sort of critical feminists, also queer scholars, who contributed a lot to the debate regarding Resolution 1325 and also within peacekeeping, and the lack of connection with the more policy and practice-oriented gender and gender perspectives in the operations. I don't necessarily think these worlds are naturally connected, but it's interesting to combine them and use each other lessons. And I come from a background with an interest in field research. In particular, I spent a lot of time in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC, working on gender aspects of the peace operation there, MONUSCO. And this, for instance, within the sexual violence aspect, protection against gender-based violence, and also gendered security understanding within the troops of MONUSCO. So as many of you know, the Resolution 1325 has to a large extent contributed to a political discourse that both men and women are relevant and important actors, but also acknowledging that they're victims in war and armed conflicts, and they should be equally engaged in the realms of peace and security. And perhaps the most important aspect of 1325 has been its normative change in the discourse, accepting and acknowledging these aspects that women are also important stakeholders and can no longer be excluded. So the research focus was the aspect, as I said, on gender and gender perspectives within international peace operations, including African Union. So this is the policy and practice. What does these things mean in the way we see it in the field and in the policy literature? And also discuss it in the light of gender, feminist, and queer literature and the theory. So, as I said, I mean, despite important and interesting work in both academia and in both fields, I believe the policies and practitioners' debate is lagging behind in essentialist approaches to gender and gender perspectives. Yes, and the case studies we have done, which I won't go into in depth, is the MONUSCO mission in DRC, and also the AMISOM mission in Somalia, the African-led mission. So, main argument is that international peace operations involves preservation of masculine values in order to maintain the institutional idea of men being more important and doing the most important manly activity, namely protecting states and people. And interpretation of gendered security in this context is reduced to an idea of protecting female bodies through masculine norms and practices. And I think there is a scarcity especially in the policy literature to address the production of masculinity in security and development discourses within peacekeeping. And instead, gender perspectives is usually addressed as in separate units and units liaising with women's organizations, or discussed as a women-only related topic. So basically also what I mean by gender perspectives. This can be something, this is Cohen, she has written on this, it could be something very concrete. It could be also something very contested and discursive. You can, for instance, have on the more concrete aspects, more technical issues of gender advisors, budget, gender training, or it could be discursive and discussed in terms of what counts as security. It means also to make claims about feminine and masculine security and challenge power relations in existing security discourses. So the way I interpret gender perspectives are different ways of understanding and structuring issues of importance based on women and men's different roles and experiences and positions in both private and public realm. And you know that men will have different access, might have different access and address certain challenges as individuals or as a group, and women will also be able to, to have effect and challenge different things as women, depending on this more constructed role of where they are positioned in society. Just to give you sort of a more illustration, this is, I don't know exactly what was going on within, when these pictures were taken, but to me they exemplify a difference between what are the core issues and what are the more sort of add-on additional issues that you need to address in a peace operation. And in the study we found that gender perspectives have a very limited or narrow approach to gender perspective, either as a victimized approach, saying women as in need of special protection, as particular, and also the need of adding women to the overall body of peace operations. So in a sense, you can say that women are either peacemakers or victims of sexual violence, and this is what I also would call sort of an essentialist approach, because it creates sort of an innate characteristic of women in general as a group. And I'm just illustrating here because in this picture on the left, you might consider that they are discussing core issues in the UN, like state building, security sector reform, protection of civilians through military means, and this is at the core of a UN operation. And in this place, you have only men, and where there are only men, it is generally no or very limited understanding or inclusion, to that matter, on gender perspective, because gender is often interpreted as women or women and children. So men have no gender, and masculinity is not considered in this group. So indirectly, you can say that international peace and security means to maintain masculine values, preserve an idea of men being more important, and masculine values being at the core in protecting states and civilians. So on the picture on the right, this is actually taken from the UN's own webpage on gender and peacekeeping. So if you look that up, you will find it. And certainly, helping women with, let's say, water filters. I'm not entirely sure there, but it is a life-saving activity, for instance. But it is also a sort of an add-on issue. It's maybe considered a soft issue and not at the core of activities. So pure gender activities, to say in practice, is that you add women to various national institutions like the parliament, the police, maybe as peacekeepers, depending on which level, if you're looking at the national or international, or on the other hand, as victims, victims of sexual violence, gender-based violence, and in need for special protection. And I think the language of confusing gender with women and the special protection for women against these types of violence constrains women into being defined by their body, the exact opposite of the sort of conceptual understanding of gender constructions. Just another example as well, the image versus practice. I think if you ever try also to Google gender peacekeeping, you will probably find most pictures like that on the right. This, and it is a discrepancy between how perhaps the UN wants to present itself, the image globally, by fronting women as peacekeepers, while in robust UN missions, like in the DR Congo, you will have a huge emphasis on the military aspects. And so the man in this picture, he's force commander of MONUSCO. And in this circle, this group, you will have an understanding, now I'm generalizing, but that there is no need for discussing gender issues when it comes to these decisive military actions, because gender is, again, considered something as related to women, and since there are no women, there are no gender issues. But when you read the literature in gender studies, on feminist literature, you have the military is one of the most gendered institutions in the world, and it represents a laboratory of studying masculinity and power. So militaries are the most perhaps gendered institutions in the world, and it privileged what is constructed as masculine over what is constructed as feminine in order to preserve this institution. And Schoberg and Gentry have, in a book, 2007, they have argued that masculinity is not a gender, it is the norm, because often unwittingly, gendered institutions present themselves as gender neutral or gender equal. The major components we have studied in this report have a large group of armed forces or soldiers on the ground, but here gender is sort of considered irrelevant or out of context. And part of this problem, I think, also comes with how, as Marcia Henry had discussed, is the way how Resolution 1325 does not distinguish between gender and women. It is used interchangeably, or as women and girls. So masculinity remains often undiscussed in these operations. And finally, on the policy literature, you have that men. If you read policy literature on gender and peacekeeping, you will find that men are generally considered, if at all, passively to women, often implying that men are the power holders, the advantage group, or potentially as perpetrators of violence against women. Now, representing men in that way makes it very difficult to engage in a gender discourse for handling the problems, interests, and differences that exist also among men and boys in any country. And also that men being being man doesn't automatically make you either powerful or a violent rebel. And it's very unfortunate, I think, that there is no or very little recognition of men being also victims of sexual and gender-based violence. So, finally, just to conclude on some of the literature remark, I think especially one article that I always kind of enjoyed is this No Angry Women at the United Nations, Political Dreams and the Cultural Politics of United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, where you actually have a situation, this is a case study, just after 9/11, and you had the invasion of Iraq. And two Iraqi women, they spoke at an informal meeting in the UN, which generated a lot of embarrassment for UN gender advocates, because it didn't follow the norms that were expected of them. they were very critical to the American and British invasion of Iraq, and they weren't discussing their views in the frame of a sort of discourse that situate women as peacemakers. And another word that I also, well, I wouldn't say enjoy, but I think is a good word for explaining some of the things that is happening in UN operations. You have the term gender mainstreaming as a political policy term. But you can, Laura Sherberg and Karen Gentry, they called it male streaming, because the male and masculine norms dominate the areas of, for instance, security sector reform, strengthening state institutions, and rule of law. So I think I will stop there. Thank you.
And last, but definitely not least, Kathleen Jennings, please.
Oh, I have a just keep talking to entertain the crowd.
I can sing and dance a little bit. That would at least entertain people, because then I will have something to laugh of.
Christmas carols?
Oh, I don't know about that.
Notice that Paul was the only one who could do it. Okay. This is great. Okay. Thank you, Morten and Randi and Paul, for very interesting contributions. And I don't have a PowerPoint, so I'm just kind of winging it here. And I'm going to try to muddy the waters even a little bit more now and talk about this peacekeeping economy project that Morten referred to in the beginning, and a little bit about what the peacekeeping economy and the gendering of the peacekeeping economy can actually teach us, or what sort of insights we can get from that onto peacekeeping in general. And just to briefly situate you on the peacekeeping economy, and Morten, I'm not going to allow you to jump in here if you disagree with me. You're just going to have to remain quiet. But I mean, I use the term peacekeeping economy, which is actually, Paul was actually the initiator with a colleague, Marcia Henry, of this term back in 2004. But we've been using it to refer to the kind of formal and informal economy that grows up around peacekeeping operations, which I think a useful way to think of it is that the peacekeeping economy sort of frames and contains the peacekeeping bubble in which peacekeepers live, work, and socialize. And so the peacekeeping economy concept, the way that we're using it, it includes the locals who are working for the UN mission or for associated agencies, and who are also working in the various service sectors that are kind of enable peacekeeping and peacekeepers to function. So you have quite a lot of informal activity that is sort of encompassed in this concept. And so the useful thing about the peacekeeping economy is that it encompasses both the local and international. So, I mean, the peacekeepers are sort of living in and, in a way, constituting, engaging in this economy, but so are locals. And so you can use this concept to actually try to sort of explore both local and international experiences of peacekeeping and peacekeeping sites. And so one of the things that I'm interested in is how is this peacekeeping economy gendered? And what are the implications of this gendering for the local community and for peacekeeping as policy and practice? And I've written about this in an article that came out in Security Dialogue, and so I'm actually going to be kind of, in a way, referring to that quite a lot, but then I'm also trying to kind of push the argument a bit further. I haven't quite figured out how to do that yet. But and I'm talking primarily here about the DRC and Liberia, which are the case studies from my PhD. So in order to kind of get a handle on the ways the peacekeeping economy is gendered, I ended up kind of doing this by looking at three sectors that I argue are quite characteristic of the peacekeeping economy. They're all in the service industry. And that would be domestic service, the sex industry, and the private security industry. And the reason I say they're characteristic is because they're just extremely, there's everyday engagement between peacekeepers and people in these industries. So this is something that for civilian peacekeepers in particular, who are living privately in their own, they have to organize their own accommodation in most cases and pay for it themselves. Many of them will have a domestic servant. Maybe they will share the domestic servant with other peacekeepers living in the same compound, but they are relating to someone who comes and cleans their house, or maybe does cooking, or whatever the case might be. Then the sex industry, well, this may be a little bit less prevalent, but I mean, there is, it's well known that where peacekeeping missions go, the local sex industry doesn't necessarily follow. There's usually a sex industry in the first place, but it becomes bigger. And that, it has been very much, it's not exactly a secret that peacekeeping operations are a big buyer of sexual services, not the operations themselves, but the peacekeepers in the operation. And then you have the private security industry. And this is one that a lot of people don't think that much about in relation to peacekeeping, because people always think of peacekeepers as purveyors of security, providers of security. Well, they're also consumers of security in these environments, because the peacekeeping mission, peacekeepers are expensive. Peacekeepers are expensive. It costs a lot of money to have a peacekeeper in a country. So if you're the mission in Liberia, and you need static security, static means the people guarding, just standing outside the unit, the compound guarding, and you need static security at your office compounds, or whatever the case might be, are you going to pay an extremely expensive Uruguayan peacekeeper? Or are you going to pay a much, much cheaper local security guard who works for a security company that is contracted to provide security service to the UN? Well, you're going to do for the kind of more static security, you will actually hire in local security companies or local affiliates of international security companies. Similarly with where peacekeepers live. Peacekeepers have to live in guarded compounds. It's a rule. If you're a peacekeeper, civilian peacekeeper living privately, you have to have 24-hour guard at your place of residence, be it a house, apartment block, whatever. So again, peacekeeping missions are big consumers of security. They're not just providers of security. So this is also a big component of the peacekeeping economy. And so what I tried to do in this sort of work is to take these sectors where the peacekeeper and the local actually meet on a daily basis, and look about how they're organized, how are they organized, and this is really where I try to push it a bit, that maybe it's the kind of value added of the article. How does the UN as an institution, or the mission, I should say, as an institution, and the UN peacekeeper as an individual, how do they actually relate to these sectors and to the people working in them? What are the kind of individual and institutional responses that you see in relation to the service, the sex, and the security industries in these environments? And so what I do is because of the time and because I don't want to get tackled by Morten for overgoing my time, I'm not going to go into all the details of sort of how these industries are organized in these environments. But I mean, what I can tell you is that the relevant thing to keep in mind for the purpose of this talk is that domestic service and sex work are almost entirely informal. Domestic service is very interesting, I think, in a peacekeeping environment, which is a heavily securitized environment. But there's actually very little in the way of guidance for peacekeepers on, for example, hiring people to come into their houses and clean. There's no vetting. There's no institutional relationship to these people. So a peacekeeper hires a person as a private individual, and usually the way that they vet these people is through connections, or maybe a new peacekeeper comes to a mission and he kind of takes over, or she takes over the maid from the departing peacekeeper, these kind of things. So in a way, you have these and that's essentially how the domestic service industry works most places. You have these kind of informal connections and vetting processes that work. But you have no no kind of organizational attention to this issue of domestic service, to how peacekeepers should pay their staff, to any of the sort of treatment that there are no guidelines for the treatment of domestic workers, et cetera. And then you have the sex industry, and here there are a lot of guidelines from the peacekeeping mission or from the UN as a sort of institution, which is namely that you're not supposed to do it. Peacekeepers aren't supposed to be buying sex or trading goods, services, et cetera, for sex. And yet, it does happen. And so you have actually a quite well-developed policy and enforcement apparatus, well-developed. I mean, you have a dedicated enforcement apparatus to deal with this issue. And yet, at the same time, there is, and there's a lot of education on this and initiation training, I'm not having sex, about the various policies in place around this. And yet, at the same time, there is quite a lot of non-enforcement of this policy. And it's, I think, many peacekeepers that I've talked to when we're talking about things like buying sex and about the zero tolerance policy against sex buying. Yeah, of course, but, it's not something that, peacekeepers don't want to, for example, get each other in trouble by saying that, he went home with a prostitute, whatever the case might be. The enforcement of this policy is very poor. It's really, you really have to have screwed up really badly in order to get kind of caught out on this policy. And so here you have this, again, this kind of, there's a well-developed policy, but the institutional enforcement, the institutional attitude towards sex buying in peacekeeping missions is really a little bit, I don't know. It has been a high priority, but the actual norms and enforcement haven't actually kept up in a way with the sort of priority. It's been a priority because of the scandals that have put sex buying on the agenda in a way. But within the missions themselves, I haven't experienced that the policy is something that people take extremely seriously, other than that they don't want to get caught because they don't want to have professional ramifications. But we're not talking, anyway. And then you have the security industry. And here what's relevant is that the security that the UN consumes, it's all consumed via a company. The company is the mediating force between the peacekeeper individual who might have a guard at his home and the actual person of the guard. So you have this, you're not allowed, for example, to just hire a guard. You can hire your own guard, but you won't get compensated for it. You have to hire a guard through a vetted company, for example. So you have this kind of corporate form on security that essentially kind of, in a way, is supposed to formalize the security economy in these environments. And yet at the same time, what's interesting is that the security guards, the actual embodied security guard, almost always men, many of them are ex-combatants, at least in Liberia, are subject to much of the same potential, at least, for exploitation and abuse that the women, it's primarily women, working in domestic service and sex work are. So you have these guards who are standing outside UN compounds, making, supposedly on contracts, many of them don't have contracts, making maybe $100 a month, working 12-hour shifts, no toilet breaks, no meal breaks, no water provided to them. Really horrible conditions, horrible working conditions. And yet they're standing outside of a UN compound being paid for, not them themselves personally, but the company being paid for by the UN to do this work. And so it's very interesting because what you find when you look at these three sectors is that the conditions of the people working in these industries can have a lot of overlap, where there are advantages. People tend to get that domestic servants working for UN make much better money than domestic servants working for local families. Sex workers who are selling to UN and other international clients make lots more money than sex workers selling on the local market. It's a very kind of almost a different sort of two completely different markets. They don't actually speak to each other. And then in the security, guards probably maybe have making a bit more money if they work for a company than they would if they were just privately renting themselves out to a local family, for example. But what you see is that despite these advantages, all three of these sectors contain a strong potential for exploitation of the worker, whether man or woman. And yet the institutional response at the UN level, the mission level, is very different. So like I alluded to, or like I was saying, the domestic service, there is no institutional response. It's invisible. Institutionally, domestic service is essentially invisible. On the sex work side, you have a bit of a more contradictory approach where sex work is sort of alternatively sort of pathologize these women as victims, like Rani was saying, where we have to feel the whole point of having this zero tolerance policy against buying sex is to protect women in particular, the local women in particular. But at the same time, peacekeepers' own attitudes towards women work, especially women working in these industries, are very not reflective of this view, where women, many of these women are presented as predatory. Paul has also written quite a lot about this, has sort of predatory, sexual predators. And so the institutional approach to the sex work is, on the one hand, very kind of, in a way, prohibitionist towards sex work, but on the other hand, the whole enforcement side of it is essentially missing. So you have this, again, this sort of institutional neglect in a way. Whereas the security side of the equation, even though the men working in these companies are often being quite exploited, the UN mission approach to the security industry in these environments is very much prioritized. This work is seen as, you know, extremely necessary, and it's as Zadani would perhaps say, like a core element of the UN mission. Not just the security the UN provides, but the security that is provided for them. And so I suggest that these differing institutional responses reflect, it's actually almost in a way a very sort of traditional sort of gendered ideology or approach, that the way that the kind of the women's work is sort of either invisible or in a way marginalized, and whereas the men's work, the security work, is sort of elevated and made in a way formal, made sort of official, even though the conditions of the people working in these industries may not actually differ that much in terms of working conditions and potential for exploitation. And then when you add in the individual peacekeeper responses to the people in these industries, it gets even more kind of interesting, because what you see then, or what I argue, is that the commonality that peacekeepers have towards these three sectors is a lack of trust in the local, the sort of embodied local providing these services. So they might have a domestic worker, but they don't trust them. They have a security guard outside their door, but they don't trust the security guard either. They think that the security guard maybe is going to organize an inside job, whatever the case might be. And of course, they don't trust sex workers. And what I argue is that the kind of the individual responses towards people in these industries is that, I mean, it's a very highly sexualized sort of discourses around these people. And there is sometimes even a conflation of the local as predatory, and there's this extreme lack of trust. And I argue that this has also a gender dynamic. So you see a kind of a parallel between these representations of the local as sort of untrustworthy, insufficiently grateful, and gender stereotypes of women as sort of opportunistic, unfaithful, double-dealing, manipulative, and these sort of essentially misogynistic tropes about women. And I'm not saying that peacekeepers are necessarily misogynistic. What I'm saying is you could see these tropes in the way that they relate to some of these, the people that they're relating to in their everyday life. And so I push this further then to argue that the sort of attributes that recur when peacekeepers discuss their kind of everyday interaction with in relationships with many of these local men and women are attributes that can misogynistically be coded feminine. and that this is a very kind of this, you could almost draw a straight line back to sort of colonial discourses around race and gender and how the colonizer spoke of the colonized. And then, but then if you flip that around, if you then say that, okay, what implications does that have for the peacekeeper themselves? And what I argue then is that instead of saying that you have this sort of feminized local, this sort of double-dealing, opportunistic, feminized local, and the masculine peacekeeper, well, in fact, what I contend is that the peacekeeper themselves feels extremely vulnerable. And this is a feeling that's institutionally reinforced by all the security training, by the initiation training, by the kind of messages about the local that the peacekeeper internalizes, and that peacekeepers experience locals as sources of threat. Peacekeepers are extremely vulnerable. And we're not talking about locals coming at them with guns. We're talking about the local, the climate, the people, the norms, the customs, the food. It's all a threat. And so the peacekeepers themselves are feeling very vulnerable all the time. And even though they have superior exit potential, resources, et cetera, the locals' advantages, their superior knowledge, their superior... I'm wrapping up, Morten. And their opportunism, that is experienced as sources of threat. And so what then I would argue is that instead of having the masculine protector peacekeeper and the pacific feminized local, what I argue you see is this feminized local, these sort of misogynistic almost tropes, and actually a quite feminized peacekeeper, where the peacekeeper themselves is the pacified party, vulnerable to the chaotic and disordered local.
Thank you, Kathleen.
I would now like to invite you up here. So
Yeah, but I'm...
okay.
We're standing, aren't we? Or are we sitting?
Okay, you want to stand for now? That's fine by me. I was just trying to be nice to give you chairs. Okay. Thought we could leave one there and let you play musical chairs with it, but okay, we're not going to do that. Okay, thank you, the three of you, for very interesting presentations. I will now open it up to the floor, but I'm just going to take the privilege of sort of starting off with three brief comments. One is that we'd like you to reflect upon how much this actually matters. And what I mean by that is that as I see the field of peacekeeping, particularly in Africa, the emerging field of peacekeeping is one where the UN and the African Union increasingly will attempt to fight/police endless conflicts in hostile territories. This is the new field of peacekeeping that we're seeing in Somalia. We are seeing it in the Mali Sahel. We are seeing it in Eastern Congo. How much does this actually matter if this is the future of peacekeeping? Because what we're seeing in these areas are conflicts with actors that there is no or a very narrow margin for a negotiated settlement with. We're talking here about the UN trying to police parts of the Sahel where the main insurgents on the ground are either groups like Akim or Mujao, violent Salafist groups that we, as the international community, simply do not negotiate with. So there is no room at all for a negotiated settlement. Or we are talking about bands of narco-traffickers. We don't necessarily negotiate with them either. So how much of this actually matters? What does this mean for the ideas that you have put forward, if this is the new landscape of peacekeeping? Secondly, I would like you to reflect a little bit on this sort of binary opposition between masculinity and femininity, because particularly with regard to masculinity, but also with regard to femininity, there seems to be this sort of, in my point of view, flawed understanding that we can talk about one version one type of an African manhood, that we can talk about one sort of general trope of an African femalehood. But to me, I mean, there are enormous variations here, even within a relatively small place like Eastern Congo, even within a place like North Kivu. There are enormous variations. So I would like to reflect a little bit on that. And thirdly, I could not help thinking back. I listened to Marcia Henry. I mean, your sometimes partner in crime, Paul, which gave a very interesting talk at the Nordic Africa Days in Uppsala in late September about the representations of the female in anthropological study programs. And I could not help but seeing quite a lot of the similarities, particularly with the kind of pictures that Randi showed. So I mean, this is probably a more general phenomenon than only the UN. I would like you to reflect a little bit on that. Thank you. But before I allow you to sort of address some of the issues that I put forward, I would also like to give our very patient audience a chance to come with some comments and reflections. So please, the floor is open. We take a pair of 3 questions, comments, I guess. A mic is coming your way.
Oh, okay.
And please also introduce yourself.
My name's Alexandra. I work for Care Norway. Thank you so much for 3 very interesting presentations. Care Norway is working on the Women, Peace and Security agenda in several countries, working with women's groups, building their confidence and capacities to be able to participate in peace processes, and also working on gender-based violence. I came today because I was very much interested in the participation part of 1325. As was mentioned earlier, there's a lot of focus on the protection part, seeing women as sort of victims of sexual violence. So I'm very interested in some of the policy implications of what you're saying in terms of participation. And we've been focusing on participation in peace operations, I guess, rather than peace negotiations or peace building, but on the peace operations, and in particular peacekeeping. So I'm a little bit confused by the sort of masculinity, femininity binary, as you put it. And I think part of that too is because I don't have a good understanding of what are the competencies. Paul's presentation focused on the physical skill set, but I'm sure the experience from Training for Peace and other programs, the competencies go beyond the physicality in peace operations. And I think there is more and more emphasis on having operations underpinned by a proper gender analysis and power analysis and conflict-sensitive tools and so on. So I'm wondering about the limited notion of competencies in peace operations. Thank you.
Other that you would like to ask a question or give a comment? Well, you can reflect on whether you have any comments or question while I turn the mic back to the panel. So why don't you give us some of your thoughts both concerning what my comments, but also concerning the intervention from the floor.
Yeah.
So please, Paul, if you start.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Morten, for your hard questions, and thanks to Alexandra for your question. Well, I'll link 2 things together here. I mean, Morten asked or mentioned at the beginning some of the kind of intractable conflicts that are going on. We should never think of them as that, but there's certain challenges there which bring me back really to the more militarized aspects of peace enforcement. Now, of course, we can talk about security dilemmas, so that using more force can exacerbate the problems. But I mean, one thing that I think is important to acknowledge is, if you are going to deploy peacekeepers into those kinds of contexts, how effective are they militarily? And now my thinking on this is that the UN, in part because it has not much choice over the troops it actually accepts, and it's always struggling to get troops from contributing countries, it has to take what it can get. And I think some of the troops that are arriving in these countries are not really very sufficiently well prepared to perform, high intensity combat roles. The training just doesn't provide that for them. So in that very narrow sense, I mean, that was what my talk was about. It was more really focused on the very particular aspect of, peace enforcement and direct kind of combat activities, which are part of peace enforcement. But I take your point completely that it's much more than the physical aspect. But the physical aspect seems to get a little bit lost in terms of, the requirements to get people in the mission, to get the numbers up. And there's been a long-standing problem about how well-trained troops are that get deployed to peacekeeping missions. But I think it's a debate that I haven't seen for a while, and I think it needs to be, especially in, because I think when you have peace spoilers, they have very little kind of, they have very little belief that the peacekeeping troops will be anything other than just a very token presence. And I think that is the problem here in that respect.
Thank you for comments and questions. I think a few things in terms of the mission that we studied in the report is the one mission on MONUSCO is a very old type of mission. It's been around for more than 10 years. And it is reflecting a sort of, perhaps a mission that might, not continue in future operations. You see very different missions now. So that is definitely an issue, and I don't know how it will affect also, let's say, gender aspects, gender analysis in new type of missions. That is a new interesting field. And definitely there are so many variations when it comes to manhood, let's say, or womanhood in the operation areas that I don't think is reflected enough, or it's not given enough attention, gender analysis, when it comes to understanding these variations. Because you know that a woman can be much more, an elite woman can have much more power than the majority of, let's say, men in a certain area, and vice versa. So these are, important variations. And unfortunately, the report is only reflecting the more what goes on among the internationals or the peacekeepers, let's call them that, in the missions. Your question about from Alexandra from CARE, participation is, of course, hugely a huge issue and very important. And I think, though, that there is quite a difference between international levels of, let's say, peace negotiations and also what goes on within the mission. And in the mission area, you might have much more attention to more pure protection aspects than not necessarily empowerment or these levels that I see, at least in what I studied in DRC. Though there are, of course, a lot of focus also on, or a lot, but also an issue focusing on women's organizations in the Eastern Congo. But we know that there are internationally that there has PRIO has done a lot of work on is women's participation in peace negotiations and the low percentage that they represent, just statistically, how few women are actually on the negotiating table, which is a huge, potentially quite a big problem because people will present different perspectives in negotiations, and it's very important to acknowledge that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks also to Morten and Alexandra. In terms of, I think what's important to keep in mind is what I see as a longer-term trend in peacekeeping of segregating the international peacekeeper or peace builder, come what may, from the local. And there are lots of reasons for this. And security, of course, plays a big role where there's this idea that the peacekeeper will be safer the more they are segregated from the local, but also that the local will be safer. This gets in terms of like the sexual exploitation issue if the peacekeepers are separated. So there's this idea within the UN, for example, that the best way to kind of secure the local woman's body from possible exploitation at the hands of peacekeepers is to keep the peacekeepers behind fences and gates. That's actually a fairly insulting view of their own peacekeepers, I think. But that's, in fact, how it's been operationalized. But that's certainly not the only thing driving this trend. But there is, like I said at the beginning of my talk, this peacekeeping bubble. And the important thing to keep in mind about this peacekeeping bubble is that this is not just something, it's not just a function of peacekeepers only wanting to hang out with other internationals, or of, people from the global north only wanting to hang out with each other, whatever the case might be. The peacekeeping bubble is very much institutionally almost required in a way because of the various restrictions under which peacekeepers, military and civilian, live. The various security restrictions, the various social restrictions, all these things, when you add them up together, makes for an extremely segregated and really quite risk-averse lifestyle. And it's hard to actually kind of blame. You could see very well why this happens, that the UN doesn't want to expose its personnel to greater risk. You could say military, of course, are used to be exposed to risk, but certainly on the civilian side, they don't want to be irresponsible with the lives of their civilian peacekeepers. So this is a risk reduction policy on the part of the UN that has many different facets. But what it all adds up to is that peacekeepers and locals live very segregated. And so for me, this calls into question these notions that both Randi and Paul were discussing about the kind of the role of the female peacekeeper, or the ideas around what the female peacekeeper will bring into a mission, this notion that women peacekeepers will be better able to empathize with or help local women. Well, how often do they actually get the chance? I mean, and Paul said they don't even speak the same language in many cases. Outside of I kind of question the extent to which the signaling effect of women peacekeepers is very effective when the locals almost never see these women. They have very little contact. They might have some on-duty contact. They have very little off-duty contact. And that's the same with peacekeeping men as well. Peacekeepers are now in the kind of classical, well, not classical, but in the kind of missions, certainly in the DRC and Liberia, are now so completely segregated. Now, there are peacekeepers whose job is to engage with the local civilian affairs and these type, but I'm talking about like your average mass of peacekeeper. And so this has a lot of implications, I think, for how peacekeeping is done, how peacekeeping relates to the local, how the local relates to the peacekeepers. And so in terms of competencies, I mean, I could see why I understand, of course, the importance, both signaling within the institution and the attempt to signal from the institution outward to the peacekeeping receiver, so to speak, about gender equality, about these kind of competencies. But I think that one thing is that, as both my fellow speakers were saying, is that these competencies are often based on these very essentialistic ideas of what women will bring to a mission. Not that they're bad ideas necessarily or wrong, but they, from a kind of critical feminist perspective, are essentializing. And then my other question is, again, if you're talking about signaling effect, if you're talking about competencies in terms of enabling the mission to relate better to the local, you actually have to take a step back and say, in what way is the mission relating to the local on an everyday level? And I don't actually think that's what I'm trying to problematize, is like, what is the everyday interaction that's going on? And I think that is the more the peacekeeping has tried to remove, for some reasons that are probably quite good, it's peacekeepers from the local, that has a lot of implications for how peacekeeping is done. And in terms of the more robust missions that Morten was referring to, I mean, I think this separation from the local, like I said, it happens on both the military side and on the civilian side, where you might have, like you now have in Congo, this force intervention brigade, which is a much more kind of offensive orientation in peacekeeping in Congo, but it's a very small, well, not very small, it's a small part of the larger military component. It actually has its own mandate. It's separate from the kind of larger military component. And this is not a paradigmatic shift. This is an add-on because the UN was having a crisis of credibility in the Congo, and so this is how they're addressing that. But I really don't think that it's going to, in a way, represent a sort of longer-term paradigmatic change. I think that this fortification of peacekeeping, the separation from the local, is the trend that is going to be more emblematic of peacekeeping.
Thank you. Other comments from the floor? Yes, please.
I had a question. My name is Thomas Halverson. I'm curious as to your findings. How do they make it back to HQ New York? All of your findings. How does that make it back to UN headquarters? I mean, you have an ambition that this is going to help the internal state of affairs in the UN, which, from my understanding, with your description, is in pretty bad shape. You're talking about competencies, you're talking about recruiting, you're talking about troop contributing nations, and what do they come with, what competencies, capabilities do they have? But what about UN's own recruiting process for the people they send out to missions? You know, there are a lot of different aspects here that you're touching in on, because they might use people who have fled the country 15 years ago and put them in as senior advisors or in administration, political advisors, league ads, and things like that. So are they recruiting based on competencies? Are they, you know, in their own internal procedures and processes? I could continue. But I find it interesting that you're discussing this, but I'm just curious, the end result, is it just going to be a paper and a reading and some articles and then that's it? Or is there an idea, a blueprint behind this? Thank you.
Helga first. Helga Hernes, please.
I'm sorry to say that, of course, I haven't read these papers before. But from what I have heard and read from others is that the women soldiers are very rarely recognized as women. And that the higher officers will often say, if you've got hair for all, please take them outside the helmet. I mean, so that somebody sees that these are not just soldiers, but that they're women. But even if they are recognized as women, that the local population doesn't really care that much about whether this is a woman or a man, that it is our perceptions of that women are more caring, that, and not only UE, but the higher military is hoping that they will get into better contact with the civilian population, the female, if they have female soldiers. And from what I have gathered, there is very little empirical evidence that these aims have really been fulfilled. Then, of course, I think what you were saying in the beginning, the kind of conflicts, I mean, it's a sort of a seamless bed of conflicts we have, for example, in Africa. And I think also, I wonder to what extent you have related the very small peacekeeping forces that are then in this endless area of conflicts, and to what extent the gender aspect really is very relevant. I don't mean to be negative, I'm just asking.
Yeah, so I'm Inger Skjelsbæk at PRIO. In a way to follow up on what you said, Morten, and what you also alluded to, I enjoyed your presentations, but I hear them more as, in a way, descriptive presentations of how to understand various things happening on the ground, happening, in the context of peacekeeping missions. But then if you turn it around a little bit and ask, you know, what would be, how is gender analysis used prescriptively? I mean, how can we make this useful in a way so that the UN gets feedback it needs, so that policymakers can use it in different ways? Do we need to open up, as Morten suggested, for, you know, varied masculinities and femininities and all this? So if you go from the description to the more prescriptive way of thinking, what would you have to do then, and what could that look like?
Okay, thanks for those very interesting and I think quite challenging interventions from the floor. So now I turn it back to Paul, Randi, and Kathleen. Maybe we start in the opposite order. So, Kathleen.
Yeah, thanks. No, I mean, I thank you for all these questions. I mean, I think that it's, and Henning in particular, I agree with you completely. Back in 2011, I wrote a little policy brief about UN women peacekeepers, agents of change or stranded symbols. And I was trying to look at some of the discourses that actually are being used, particularly in a UN context, to kind of argue for women peacekeepers. And it's very difficult when you're actually engaging with this debate, because coming from a kind of critical feminist perspective, the way I do, which is not necessarily prescriptive, you're kind of reading these, and you're getting all these assumptions about how women are going to work in these missions, and about, again, these kind of essentialisms that, from your critical perspective, you want to start to unpick. But on the other hand, I actually have great sympathy for people making this argument, because, I mean, if you, and I, you know, I think that if you want to have peacekeepers and you want to have more women peacekeepers because you believe that women should have equal opportunities or equality, et cetera, that argument doesn't actually fly very far in the UN. This equality argument isn't actually the one that's going to convince people. It is very much based on this kind of essentializing and very kind of linking women peacekeeping to operational effectiveness, the value added. What do women bring that will make us more effective? That's the kind of argument that flies in the UN. You need to be able to point to women will be able to have better contact with local women. Now, we don't know if this is true or not, and as Paul has pointed out, there are so few women that it's actually very difficult to try to assess this. And even if you did try to assess this, how would you do that? But then, even if you go through all those hoops, what happens if you find out at the end that actually women peacekeepers don't seem to have any better contact with local women? Well, a lot of people who are sympathetic to the project of greater women's participation aren't going to then want to have to make the argument that, oh, it doesn't really matter, you know, because in a way, the project itself is deemed a worthy project. And so you don't want to then undermine it by pointing out that actually, you know, we don't know if this is true. Women might actually not be any better at this than men, but we don't want to undermine the sort of goals of participation, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's actually a very tricky, I really sympathize with people trying to make this argument on the basis of this kind of value added and stuff, because I think that they're using the tools that are available to them and that they think will convince people to bring women into these positions. And I think that that is a very worthy thing to do. But of course, it does raise a lot of questions, and it does potentially raise a lot of problems, and opens itself up to 5 years down the line, people saying, no, it didn't work, just scrap the whole thing. And so I think that, I mean, in order to kind of make it prescriptive, I mean, that's kind of the permanent question for people like me who are very good at pick, and this kind of goes to your question, pick. Okay, well, what do we then do in order to actually try to turn this into something positive and not just a kind of tearing down? And I mean, the implication from my own work, and especially regarding what I was just talking about, this trend of segregation between the local and the international, well, the implication would be if you think that the peacekeeping would function better and peacekeepers would be better and more empathetic, men or women, doesn't matter, by having more everyday engagement with the local, then of course the implication of that would be to try to sort of encourage this kind of interaction, whether through the people you recruit or through the sort of restrictions you have, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The only problem with that recommendation is that one makes it knowing that this sort of separation and segregation isn't an accident. It's not a historical accident. It's the inevitable effect of the sort of policies that the UN has made regarding how it does peacekeeping. And then you get into a problem where, you know, I'm criticizing something that is exactly what they kind of meant. And so the conclusion that I draw is that it's not an unintended consequence that the peacekeeper segregated from the local. It's kind of a feature. It's not a bug. And so then that makes the prescription side very difficult for me, and that's not a very satisfactory answer. But I think what I would say is that I do have great sympathy for the people trying to sort of further the participation and the sort of gender projects within the UN. I think that they have a difficult job and they have to use the tools available to them. But I think these tools are very problematic, and I think the assumptions that go into a lot of their arguments are very problematic. And so then that leaves me in a position of tear down, tear down, tear down, but not necessarily of helping to build up, unfortunately.
Yeah, thank you for all your questions. Very tricky questions and comments. I think your question about the recruiting mechanisms is really, really important and an interesting aspect. In overall, I mean, those recruited and those going to these missions when it comes to troops are basically from what you call the global south. And Western countries are, rarely also contributing with significant troops. And part of that is, of course, the issue of one aspect of the body bag in democracies that you have. If you bring back a lot of bodies from missions, it's not a very popular choice. The other aspect is, of course, that armed forces are, not as big in many Western countries. In terms of the end result of these, at least speaking for myself, I don't think I will have any sort of effect in any way other than try to address this in publications and in seminars. Unfortunately, that's a reality. But I've been talking to a lot of the Pakistani troops in MONUSCO, and I think in order to, this goes back also to Inge's question about how can you be more prescriptive. I think for me the lesson learned was that I should never address the aspect of gender when it comes to these Pakistani troops. One aspect, as I talked about, was that gender is perceived as women, and in the Pakistani armed forces there are not supposed to be any women fighting, period. So there are no female peacekeepers there. But in order to address gendered sort of security, you can ask questions relating to who do you talk to in the field, who do you sort of support, and that brings out some certain and very interesting aspects when it comes to gender, because they have reflections on the local insecurity issues, like that they see a lot of women walking, for instance, to fetch water or going to the market in the DRC. And I asked maybe those areas are where you can also do more protection, because along the routes or along these areas there are also a lot of harassment or threats against these women, and that was I think, at least considering what they were responsible, that this was something definitely that they at least the person or people I spoke to hadn't considered that much. And also avoiding also using the word gender when you talk to various implementers of protection in MONUSCO, is when you start mentioning gender, then you get pointed to the gender advisor, for instance. But reframing that and asking questions about their daily tasks and then pushing some of these tasks to understanding of gender analysis without sort of pressuring that word on these implementers, practitioners, I think is at least one way of starting it. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks. So what I'm going to say is very controversial. Ultimately, UN peacekeeping is an add-on to global politics, right? That's what it is. We want to believe in the UN. We want to believe it can do all these good things. But actually, if you look at the resources, you look at the priorities given to conflicts in various parts of the world, nobody with any power really cares about those. I mean, look at the resources marshaled against Iraq in 2003. Look how much money has been spent in Afghanistan, trillions of dollars. The point is, those hegemonic powers of the global north are not interested in Congo, right? You can have some Pakistani peacekeepers deployed there. They can be there, 15,000, whatever, in total. They're not going to have an impact. The UN, we don't want to hear it, we don't like it, is an add-on to global politics. And until there's sufficient serious political engagement from those with power at the hegemonic level, it will always be the case. Now, in turn, what that means for gender, gender comes very low on the agenda. You go to DPK in New York, it's in crisis management perpetually. It hasn't got enough resources, people are running round, they take people, anybody they can get. I mean, that's the reality of the situation. So I don't want us to idealize the UN and think it can do all these things. We want to believe it can. We want to believe in the UN as some body that can actually make a real change. The reality is, it's not given the resources or credibility. I mean, the US spent a long time undermining the UN under Bush. We know that as well. And we just know that the UN has not got what it needs to do. These conflicts are not treated seriously because they're not, in a realist worldview, they're not impacting on the national interests of the US or the UK, for example. And that, for me, is the bottom line here. That's the ultimate analysis, depressing though it is, and I'm sorry for that.
Jon, please.
Jon Kolsrud, I'm the manager of the Training for Peace program here at NUPI. And so I would like to add a little bit on to the particular questions on policy impact, because that is a very important part of what we do. For us, it's very important to close that feedback loop. So if we do research, really hoped and really work for that research to become available and to be turned into tangible recommendations for policymakers, whether they be in Norway or at the field level or at headquarters in New York. So just to give a few examples, on 7 January next year, we will have a meeting in Oslo, not decided where yet, but in conjunction with the now recently established high-level panel for peace operations, where we will feed in Norwegian research views from the civil society, from different think tanks, etc. in Norway, working on peacekeeping and peace operations in general. And that's a particular window in the Norwegian context, where we will of course also feed in this research. This was the research that Randi now presented was a result of a particular effort under Training for Peace on this topic, and it would be a waste if we couldn't take that back into the feedback loop. And I mentioned the Peace Operations Review because we are at a very interesting time for peace operations. Paul mentioned that there is no real interest from hegemonic state, or so the US basically, but at the moment there is in fact a bit of interest. And during the General Assembly this autumn, Joe Biden, the Vice President, hosted a special meeting on peacekeeping, and where he really encourages Western states to re-engage, and also showed that, or said that they will consider this as part of the global burden sharing. They will host 3 meetings during the next year, in Netherlands, in Indonesia, in Uruguay, to continue that effort. And it's not been decided yet, but possibly this will end with a meeting hosted by Obama at the General Assembly next autumn. So there is really a push for Western re-engagement in peacekeeping, and that would be a good thing. We'll see whether it actually materializes. Next to the Peace Operations Review, there is also a review of the peace building architecture set up with Norway as one of the firm supporters in 2005. So there are a few entry points that don't come so often that we will see during the next year for research, for policy inputs, basically. So I just wanted to mention that. Thank you. And thank you for your great presentations. Yeah.
Thanks, Jon. I'll sort of misuse my privilege as a chair once more, and just to challenge you a little bit further about this, about, what is this all about? I mean, if I would sort of sum up some of what you have, your responses, but also some of the comments. I mean, it is about being relevant, isn't it? I mean, it's about how you can be relevant. And to me, I mean, relevance must be measured against how it's seen from the local populations. Do they feel that the UN is relevant to their problems, to their livelihood challenges, to their security issues that they have to negotiate every day? Sometimes, but unfortunately, often, they do not find the UN very relevant. And therefore, you have groups, for instance, in Eastern Congo that are forced, small and large communities that are forced to negotiate their own security wherever they think they can, with whoever actors they think can improve their security on the ground there and then. This is what forces parts of the local population of, for instance, Walikale into sort of ad hoc negotiated agreements with the FDLR. This is what gave rise to the Raya Mtobuke phenomenon, and so on and so forth. So how can the UN become more relevant in this regard? Is it really, what we are talking about, you didn't use that word, Kathleen, but we are talking about that the international community lives in these places in gated communities. It's gated communities. Is the answer to this to become less risk averse, to tear down these gates, to open up the compounds, to having UN personnel living out in local communities? I think that's maybe one of the answers. The question is if we are willing to take that risk, because this is a strategy that will be risky. It will mean that more UN personnel lives will be lost in the field. But I don't think there is really any other alternative to it. It means that we need to sort of stop living behind walls and engaging with the issues where they affect people the most. For instance, in parts of northern Mali. Because what is happening now is that parts of the world is becoming blank spots on the global map. We are seeing a re-emergence of these old blank spots from the colonial maps. Well, we know what's there of geography, topography, of these kind of things, but we have absolutely no clue what is going on there. We don't know what is happening in northern Mali. Outside of Timbuktu and Gao, we have no clue of what is going on. And having people out there would also mean that we would have a better intelligence, and that could make the UN more relevant. Whether that, in what degree this sort of speaks to this issue of the gender component and issues concerning having female troops or not, I'm a little uncertain, because I would think that for a local traditional Tuareg woman, the first sort of, if you want to engage with her, at least you need to speak either Tamashek or French. But secondly, for her, I think a woman in combat fatigue would look much more alienating than, in fact, meeting a man with a weapon. Because that she is used to seeing men with weapons, but seeing a woman with weapon would probably, for her, at least initially, feel more alienating and threatening than meeting a man with guns. But anyway, is the answer to it to tear down the walls? So I'll leave you with that final challenge. So please, short final comments from the panelists. You decide who starts.
Yeah, tear down the walls. Sounds great. And thank you also, John, for mentioning the impact. I didn't mean to sound very pessimistic about the research, but I think just to give you also an example of, I think one of the most interesting aspects of MONUSCO has been this community liaison assistance that is local people speaking multiple languages, including English, and who relate both to the peacekeepers and the civilian offices, and are present in the various communities without being actually from the community themselves. Those type of interlinkages, I think, is a very, very good alternative also to improve understanding and also to empower the communities themselves, so that these community liaison assistants, the Congolese, they push for addressing who are the main authorities on these aspects, who are the community leaders here, who are the women's groups leaders, and then if any security incident is about to occur, they know the local communities would know who to call, basically. Things like that is at least, I think, a good innovation in peacekeeping. It is bringing down closer to a community peacekeeping, but still, of course, you have the aspect of peacekeepers still being within the gates, so they are risk averse, and instead sending out Congolese who themselves take a huge risk actually in this aspect. So, yeah, thank you.
Well, yes, I agree, tear down the walls, but unfortunately the logics of security are going, as Randy mentioned, very much in the opposite direction. Risk aversion, use of drones, etc., in military conflicts. The other thing that's driving this, of course, is the private insurance sector, which has got a lot of influence and sway over how the UN conducts itself. So we have to look outside of the UN as well. We have to look at the neoliberalization of UN peacekeeping, not just in terms of private security, the growing presence of private security, but also in terms of how that gets institutionalized into the logic of neoliberalization, which is obviously affecting increasing numbers of sectors. There's nothing really, to my knowledge, going in the opposite direction. So it's an interlinking of a kind of neoliberal security nexus, if you like, to put it in those broader terms, which is fueling these trends and logics. Now, I don't know how you get out of that. I'm not sure what to put the brake on that. I'm not sure how that can be done, because it is like a huge and unstoppable juggernaut in some ways. I don't think we should give up hope, but the neoliberalization of these sectors, particularly the UN, actually, I think, increasingly reacting to the fact that it can't get the resources it needs, it will turn to other avenues, even if they're not as effective.
Yeah. I mean, I think kind of bringing together Paul's not last answer, but the one before that, the kind of downer answer that he gave, and Morten's last intervention. I mean, Morten asked, Morten said this is about being relevant, and I agree. And then he asked, who is the audience? Who are we being relevant for? And he answered that with the local. Well, there I disagree. I mean, I think ideally that should be the audience for UN peacekeeping. But I mean, UN peacekeeping is a huge conglomerate of lots of different interests. So the Pakistan as a TCC, as a troop contributing country, their audience is not the local. If they want to be seen as relevant, it's to be relevant to more on the kind of global politics as, a troop contributing country, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you could kind of go through and identify lots of different interests. And so, of course, if your audience is the local, then the answer is tear down these walls. If your audience is your domestic public, then the answer is certainly not tear down these walls, for example. I think that the sort of way that peacekeeping is done now in this very removed, very segregated way does inhibit a more kind of empathetic and effective approach to peacekeeping that is relevant to the audience, to the local, I should say. But I think that it's very difficult to imagine a situation, as Paul was alluding to now, where these incentives can actually be refashioned. So I don't really have an answer, I guess, but I would say that I mean, as analysts or as people looking at peacekeeping, we're talking about being prescriptive. We are talking as if peacekeeping matters, because if we concede that it doesn't, then what are we doing? Why are we wasting our time? But it is sadly the case that I do tend to agree with Paul that peacekeeping is a tool of last resort, and of last resort in the sense that if it doesn't matter enough for a bilateral or a this or that, then you call in the peacekeepers, and sometimes that doesn't even happen, and that gender is certainly not the core. It's certainly an add-on. It's certainly a sort of additional thing that we do to make UN peacekeeping sort of different from the normal military operations. Well, UN peacekeeping is different from normal military operations already because of the fact that it's peacekeeping, and I think it would be very refreshing to tear down the walls, but that would require putting the local as the referent actor. And that's not the case in UN peacekeeping, sadly. There are far too many other interests and incentives to prohibit that. So.
Okay. With that sobering note from Kathleen, I think we have come to the end of this seminar. But I would at least add that I mean, part of our job should also be to try to imagine possible other pathways than those that we see. And if we don't even imagine them, then they will certainly not materialize. So maybe we should try to imagine them, and perhaps with these reviews now coming up, this is a good time to try to imagine them, because obviously, I mean, you know, this is not going to lead to a sort of watershed in how peacekeeping is doing, but it may be one way of trying to sort of tilt things in a slightly more constructive direction than the direction it currently has taken. And we should not give up on that attempt. But for now, please join me in thanking the panelists.